Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, excuse me. Welcome to our 109th program of America at a Crossroads. Welcome from Jews United for Democracy and Justice, and from community advocates, and from our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, Xavier Oslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lehrer, and myself. These are very difficult times, to be sure. Between the January 6th hearings, the uncertainty of the approaching midterm elections, the war in Ukraine, the country's economic woes, and more. We hope that this weekly program helps to keep you informed and confirms to you that you are part of a large community of people who are passionate about the preservation of our democracy. I think I speak for our leadership team when I say that planning these programs for this America at a Crossroads community keeps our spirits buoyed and elevates our spirit. We are very pleased tonight to welcome once again Ron Brownstein in conversation with Bob Shrum. In the midst of primaries across the country and the January 6th public hearings, tonight's conversation is sure to be stimulating and enlightening. Next week, we once again address the critical topic of voter suppression with two terrific experts. Greg Bluestein, a political reporter, frequently writes about voter suppression. He works at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and is a frequent MSNBC and NBC contributor who wrote the recently published book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. He will be joined by one of our favorite returning guests, who is also one of the nation's most respected election law and voting rights and voter suppression scholars, and that's Rick Hasson, author of Cheap Speech, and the program will be moderated by Pat Morrison. The following week, we will be joined by journalism's power couple, Peter Baker of the New York Times and Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, both of whom were Russia-based foreign correspondents who chronicled the rise of Vladimir Putin. They will be in conversation with Madeline Brand and will be discussing the Russo-Ukraine war. Where are we and how will it end? Thanks again for being with us. And now for a few more announcements, my terrific colleague, David Lehrer. David?
Thank you, Janice. I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion with the maven of election math, Ron Brownstein, and the man who has crafted many of the most memorable speeches in recent American political history, Bob Shrum. This is one exceptional week in which to hear from these experienced political analysts. Since we last met, there have been two riveting hearings that have resonated with much of the American public, and our guests are the voices you want to hear from to figure out what it all means and what it means now and 5 months from now. In 3 weeks, we'll hear from the New York Times' David Brooks, one of the most distinguished writers at the paper, who has been on the op-ed page for nearly 20 years. He is a pundit whose wisdom is sought weekly by the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. His voice is one of sanity and reason. The following week, we will have the author of the New York Times bestseller, Freezing Order, Bill Browder. He was in the 90s Russia's largest foreign investor, and he founded a huge investment fund. He became a target of Putin's ire. He will talk about his firsthand experience with murder, money laundering, and teach us how to deal with Putin and the Russian system. In subsequent weeks, we'll have the eminent social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, former Ambassador Dennis Ross, former presidential advisor David Yergin, and the chair of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, a rather timely topic given the dozens of mass shootings that have occurred just since the Uvalde, Texas tragedy, Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. You cannot miss a week. To engage in a dialogue with our guest tonight, we are fortunate to have Bob Shrum joining us once again, as Janice mentioned. He's the director of the Center for the Political Future at the University of Southern California and holder of the Carmen and Lou Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics. It should be a fascinating hour. Bob?
First of all, I promise we're not going to talk about murder tonight, maybe political murder, but we'll see. So thank you, David and Janice. I'm honored to once again be part of such a worthy and enlightening series. And I'm honored to be here with Ron Brownstein, one of the most insightful commentators on American politics today. He's the author of an extraordinary book, which you'll see in the background when we go to him, called Rock Me on the Water, about 1974, when events here in Los Angeles transformed our movies, our music, our television, and our politics. Tonight, we're going to talk about the transformative and perhaps foreboding events of our own time and our own politics. I'll ask Ron some questions. We'll go back and forth. I suspect he'll ask me questions as well. At 5:40 or so, we're going to turn to your questions. Just put them in the chat and I'll be able to read them out. Ron, since we are in the midst of the midterm primaries, we had some yesterday. Let me start with this question. How is Trump doing as he endorses candidate after candidate? And do the results suggest that the future of the GOP belongs to him?
Bob, first of all, great to be here with you and great to be back in front of this audience. Fittingly enough, with Stranger Things back out, I feel a little like I'm in the Upside Down because it's usually me asking you questions over our relationship of the last 40 years, but you know, you can try anything once, right? So I'm glad to be on the receiving end. You know, look, and I certainly think you know this better than I do. No political figure succeeds in all of their endorsements. No one can, you know, direct voters. Obama voters don't always vote for Obama's candidate, or Clinton voters. And Trump inexorably has won some and he's lost some. I think he has, you know, he's obviously won a few high-profile races: the Ohio Senate race, the North Carolina Senate race, the Pennsylvania governor's race, one of the House primaries last night. But I think the issue is less who Trump has endorsed than who has endorsed Trump. I mean, whatever we think about Trump's personal scorecard, Trumpism is continuing to advance in the Republican Party on multiple fronts. I mean, first of all, you don't really, other than Tom Rice last night, who you know lost badly in South Carolina, you have very few candidates who did not get Trump's endorsement criticizing him or arguing that his kind of belligerent nationalism and appeals to racial resentment are a dead end for the party. And even more importantly, you have an astonishing number of candidates echoing his claims of election fraud in 2020 and the big lie. And this extends beyond kind of general House and Senate candidates to, as I've written, there are a stunning number of Republicans not only running in, but winning primaries, including last night in Nevada, for positions of control over the administration of the 2024 election. Republicans are nominating in places as diverse as Minnesota, Michigan, and Nevada, Pennsylvania. They're nominating candidates who are adherents of the big lie and are basically saying the election was stolen from Trump. You know, in Georgia, they were beaten back. And I think Trump overplayed his hand there by endorsing so many candidates against incumbent Republicans. But it is stunning the extent, in virtually every state that will decide 2024, there are Republicans seeking either Secretary of State or Attorney General or governor positions who are adherents of the big lie. So I would say, whatever his personal scorecard, and it's mixed, I think it's better than most political leaders, but it's obviously not perfect. Trumpism is continuing to consolidate its hold in the Republican Party, I think.
Yeah, David asked if we could begin with something optimistic. So I'll give it a try in light of all that. Is there maybe a little bit of good news in some of this for Democrats, in that a number of successful Trump choices, like Doug Mastriano, the GOP nominee for governor in Pennsylvania, who has said extraordinarily repellent things, at least in my view, may actually be easier to defeat in the fall?
Absolutely, right? I mean, you know, and we're going to talk about the midterm in a minute. We can get to the broader issues of how relevant it will be. Historically, in the House, the quality of the candidates doesn't matter that much. You know, House elections tend to just kind of be very much influenced by the national current. And if it's bad for one party, I'm sure there are cases, but by and large, you know, those are very parliamentary elections. The history of Senate and governor races are a little different, though. I mean, they are still a little more personalized. They're not just simply dependent variables on the national climate. And whether we're talking about the Pennsylvania governor's race, potentially the Arizona governor's race, certainly Herschel Walker in Georgia, you know, is going to test to the max how parliamentary our elections are, because on a personal comparison, I mean, there's just no conceivable way that he would beat Raphael Warnock. I mean, there are so many problems for Walker that just seem to mount by the day. lies about his background, accusations of spousal abuse, and the discovery of a son that he hasn't acknowledged, which Greg, your next week guest, will enlighten people further on. So sure, there are candidates who are weaker, and that will matter in governor and other statewide races. I think it's less relevant in the House, which I think is more of just kind of a, the House races are almost like just sticking a gauge down into the water to see how high the current is, or how high the tide is. And, it's probably going to be reasonably high for Democrats.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second,
Yeah.
but let me do a couple of individual candidates.
You bet.
Does Liz Cheney have a chance to survive in Wyoming?
I would be surprised. I mean, you would need a significant Democratic crossover vote, right? I just think it's going to be hard for her to be so. Wyoming is a small. It's very conservative, and I think that would be a surprise. I'd be less surprised to see her as an independent presidential candidate in 2024 if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee.
Maybe if Jackson Hole came in first,
Yes,
and they
exactly.
counted the ballots there, and she called for a halt to the ballot counting.
Yes, if she could stop the balloting after Jackson Hole.
I actually think there are going to be a lot of Democrats who
Yeah,
actually do go in and do take a Republican primary ballot and become Republicans for a day.
And that helped Raffensperger in Georgia, as you know.
Right.
I think he would have won anyway. But I think that and we'll come back to this when we talk about the January 6th committee. I mean, the real problem she's got is that many Republicans who know better, who know that January 6th and the broader campaign to undermine the election is dangerous and fundamentally un-American, they won't speak up in support of the January 6th committee. The furthest they'll go is to not condemn it. So she's kind of, she's left with extra. I mean, if Mitch McConnell would be more forthright in saying this is something that had to be done, and I'm glad she's doing it, that would be a different world. But we're not in that world. The most he will do is not condemn her.
Two other candidates, quick takes. Dr. Oz, who's running for the Senate as the Republican nominee in Pennsylvania, who doesn't live in Pennsylvania, and in fact appears to have an address in Pennsylvania that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And Sarah Palin, are we going to have her around as a member of Congress for at least the next 2 years?
I don't have a good feeling on Alaska, so I can't really help you there. I could imagine her not winning, though. I could imagine people being tired of the act. Oz is kind of like, a lesser version of Walker. In normal circumstances, he would be a very weak candidate, I think. The question is, and especially with Mastriano on the ticket, at the top of the ticket, creating weakness for Republicans up and down the ballot, I still give Fetterman the edge, assuming that, I think the reports on his health are less sanguine than initially, obviously, the fact that he's still off the trail, than initially portrayed. But I would still give him the edge. I think he's a fairly good foil for Fetterman, essentially a rich guy from Jersey coming in to buy the seat. But again, it really depends how high the wave is, how big the wave is.
Yeah, I think the nature of I'll comment on Alaska. The nature of the Alaska electoral process, I think, hurts Palin. Yeah. She might easily have won a Republican primary and then on the natural had a good chance to prevail in the general. But since the top 4 candidates go on to the general and there's ranked choice voting, I suspect that she might end up first as they count the ballots initially. But then when they count more and more and more the ballots and people drop out and votes are reallocated from the 4th place candidate, I think she might be in some real trouble.
I can't imagine she's the second choice of a lot of people. I mean, she's probably pretty far down the list for for anybody who wasn't voting for her in the first place.
Yes, I think she gets all the votes. Almost all the votes she's going to get are going to come to her on that initial round. Let me turn more to the Democrats. You talked about this, the thermometer in the water, the gauge in the water, the referendum nature of a midterm. Is there anything that President Biden should have done already or can do now to aid Democrats in the midterms? Do they have any realistic hopes this November, or is it a red tsunami that's inevitable?
So I think they have one hope. I think there are many factors that would point towards significant Republican gains in the midterm. I mean, you kind of look across the board, and you know these as well as I do. First of all, presidential approvals in the low four. First of all, history is that going back to the Republicans have to win 5 seats. I guess it's 4 now after last night in Texas, but let's stick with the 5. They have to win 5 seats to.
Well, they're going to lose. They're going to lose the Texas seat probably in November, because that's gone from a +4 Biden district to a +16 Biden district.
So Republicans need 5 seats to win the House majority. There have only been 4 midterms since 1870, when the party holding the White House hasn't lost at least that many seats. Okay, so there's a long history here. And, you know, sometimes the president is in a good position when the midterm happens, and sometimes in a weak position. You know, people sometimes say, well, it's fundamentally a referendum on the president, a midterm. You wouldn't have as consistent a pattern if it was fundamentally a referendum on the president. I think the fundamental problem is that the party in the White House, their voters feel less urgency about voting than the party that's out of the White House. It's just a very long-standing tradition, and it really takes something big to interrupt that in ordinary circumstances. So what are the counter examples? I mean, it's 1934, the first 2 years of the New Deal Congress. It's 1962 in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's 1998. With the Clinton impeachment and the backlash against that. And it's 2002 with 9/11. I mean, big external exogenous events. So that's the House side. Second, you know, when the president's approval rating is low, it's usually tougher for his party. And Biden is really stuck in the low 40s right now. And, you know, hasn't really been able to escape that since last fall. And there's very little prospect that it's going to get a lot better between now and November, particularly because of factor number 3, which is inflation at over 8%. We haven't had inflation at over 8%. You know, we haven't had inflation be a significant part of our politics since an era that you were very familiar with. And one of the things I want to ask you about when I get a chance later is, you know, Jimmy Carter running in an environment of high inflation against someone that you knew well and revered and advised, Ted Kennedy. I mean, inflation is a little bit like a kudzu. I mean, it kind of crowds out everything else. People feel it in a way they don't. And I think for swing voters, you know, I think midterms are a referendum on the immediate status of the country. They're not really this kind of, you know, people say presidential elections are always about the future. I think midterms are about the present, people's judgment on how things are going. And if they don't think things are going great, they tend to take it out on the party in power. So you've got swing voters who I think are dissatisfied with current conditions. You've got a lot of Democratic voters who are dissatisfied with current conditions. I mean, Biden's approval rating among young people and Hispanics is really astonishingly bad, especially young people. You know, he got, even though they weren't wild about him to begin with, he got about 60% of the vote among younger adults, and his approval rating consistently now is under 40% among them. So you've got conditions. You've also got, I think, a certain amount of disenchantment in the Democratic coalition.
Ron, are you going to get to anything hopeful?
Yeah, I am in a minute. I'm giving you all of the signs on this side of the ledger. And I think you also got disenchantment in big portions of the Democratic coalition about what Manchin and Sinema and the filibuster have prevented them from doing. You know, it is truly astonishing what the House has passed. People have not focused, I'm actually writing about this, people have not focused on the fact that with a 5-seat majority, you know, they have passed virtually every item on the Democratic agenda with only 1 or 2 vote in dissent, compared to the Obama era or the Clinton era. Just astonishing. But of course, much of that has been blocked by the Senate. And you talk to Democratic pollsters, a lot of frustration. So you add up all those things, Bob, and you would say, okay, this is shaping up as a typical, you know, 2006, 1982, 2018 for the Republicans, 2010, 1994 for the Democrats. Is there anything that could be different? There is one thing that could be different, I think, and that is this. People have calculated, actually, a person has calculated, Mike Podhorzer, who is the chief political advisor to the AFL-CIO and has been for decades, using the data of Catalyst, a Democratic targeting firm, has calculated that over 90 million separate individuals, not 90 million votes, 90 million separate people have come out to vote against Trump and Trumpism in one of the past 3 elections, 2016, 2018, or 2020, many of them and more, but at least something like 92, 93 million people. And if you think about what you need to have a successful midterm, there were 120 million people who voted in 2018. There were, let me see, 80 million who voted in 2014 and 90 million who voted in 2010. So probably somewhere in the middle, maybe 100, 110 million at the outside. I don't think 120 million to vote again. There might be 110 million people voting, let's say somewhere between 100 and 110. There are over 90 million people who have come out to vote against Trump in the last 3 elections. So can Democrats convince 55 million, 58 million? They need more than half because of the imbalances, but can they convince 55 or 60 million of that 90 million to show up in a midterm on the argument that however disappointed you are with the way things are going, you need the fight that you enlisted in these last 3 elections is not over. You have to participate in it again. Trumpism, the threat to democracy, the threat to pluralism, the threat to a diverse, inclusive society, all of that is still on the table. Long answer, but I kind of think that is the one pathway to avoiding the worst. I think it's very hard to imagine them holding the House. I do not find it impossible to imagine them holding the Senate. And I think if they can hold the Senate, it will largely be in part because of what you said, the individual candidates, but also because of the ability to turn out Democratic voters on the argument that the fight that you came out to participate in isn't over.
Given that Democrats may lose the House and what you just said about the House, I have to offer my own opinion that Nancy Pelosi has proved to be the most masterful Speaker of the House in modern history, if not in all history. It's extraordinary what she's done. I ask you about Biden, and I'm going to throw my own oar in the water here. In 1934, one of the years you cite as an exception, the economic recovery was actually pretty sluggish. It didn't really pick up until 35 and then 36 when Roosevelt wins his landslide. But 34 was a landslide for midterm Democrats. And the reason I believe it was because Roosevelt appeared to be doing a set of things that weren't all working immediately, or didn't seem to be working immediately, but that people thought represented action on the problems they cared most about. One of the things I don't, that I think Biden should have done, maybe still can do, is at some point give a major Oval Office address on inflation, where he says, here are the things I'm going to do, not here's what the Fed, the Fed will do its part, the Federal Reserve, and certainly not, this is an international problem. Herbert Hoover road tested that argument in the Depression in 1932. It didn't work out very well. People expect the President of the United States to take hold of these challenges and to do something about them. I think if Biden did that, he would actually materially improve Democratic prospects. Now, that means he has to get his people together and say, don't come in here and tell me what we can't do. Come in here and tell me what we can do and what authority I have to act in various areas. And he'd probably have to offend some constituencies. He'd, for example, have to say, we are temporarily going to have to increase oil and gas production, and here's the way we're going to do it. And that would get some of the environmentalists angry. But I think that's the only thing he could do that could make a huge difference at this point.
I'm thinking about another Democratic president who gave a speech on the crisis of inflation and energy in 1979, Carter's malaise speech, in which he never uttered the words that obviously left him in a worse position than when he started. I actually think,
but Ron, in that speech, he offered nothing in terms of policy. He went out, he told people to go out and say something good about America.
Well,
that was his big ask.
Christopher Lash. He had read too much Christopher Lash and listened too much maybe to your former partner, Pat Cadell. But I would say this about Biden has already made an important pivot that has been blocked by really Joe Manchin alone. I mean, in the State of the Union, I think a lot of Democratic consultants that I talked to were really impressed and pleased by the way he took the shards that were left of Build Back Better and repackaged it as a way to help families deal with their day-to-day costs in an era of rising prices. Like, we are going to help you with your childcare costs. We're going to help you with your healthcare costs. We're going to bring down the cost of drugs. Reframing the climate agenda as a way to bring down your utility bills through retrofitting and things like that, which they have evidence for. And he did that again. I saw this week when he was at the AFL CIO in Pennsylvania, and that I think if Democrats could go to voters and say, we know this is tough, but here are the things that we are doing to help you deal with these daily costs, in addition to what you're saying about energy, I think they would be in a much better position. Manchin won't let them, and his grounds are that it will cause inflation. I will point out that Larry Summers, who is now looking like the road not taken, who was the former Treasury Secretary under Clinton and the White House economic advisor under Obama, was the loudest voice saying the initial rescue plan was too big after the other ones and could spark inflation. He was interviewed the other day by the Washington Post in one of their live events, David Ignatius, great columnist. And Ignatius kind of asked him this leading question. I don't know if you saw this, Bob. He said, doesn't the Democratic Party and the country owe Joe Manchin a debt of gratitude for blocking Build Back Better because of its potential impact on inflation? And Larry said quite the opposite. Right? He said, I actually think Build Back Better would help stabilize the macroeconomic situation because it would take money out of the economy in the short run because of the taxes, and then it would put it back in the long run through investments in, all these different kinds of investments in families and individuals. So you've got a situation where Manchin is arguing against doing Build Back Better on the grounds of inflation, when in fact it's really, I think, about his need to be seen as the Democrat who says no to other Democrats, and really leaving the Democrats with very little tangible they can do. If he would let them basically pass an agenda that gives families help in their day-to-day expenses, I think they would be in a much better position. But we just don't see this. As the weeks go by and it not happening, it just becomes more implausible to imagine him ultimately getting to yes.
Yeah, I want to move on from this, but I'd say two things. Number one, putting the State of the Union aside, I think a speech during the day to the AFL-CIO in Pittsburgh in the era when the presidential bully pulpit has become a presidential lectern and attention is fragmented and divided, I don't think that reaches most Americans. No, I think you'd have to do this in the Oval Office, sitting behind the desk, and it starts, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, and people know that something's important is happening if you're using that setting. Secondly, I think, and I don't have the answer to this, I'm no expert. If I were the president, I would say to the people who do know what's permissible, what can I do by executive order that will make a difference? Clearly, one thing he can do, by the way, or probably can do, is cancel some or all of student loan debt, which would actually help a lot of middle-class folks who are struggling to pay off their debts while they're also struggling to buy gas. I don't know that any of this will happen, but I actually think Biden could do things that might help Democrats in a material way as they approach November, which would defy the old logic, by the way, that which is this thing is set in concrete by June or May. But I think the world moves on much faster now than it used to, so it may not be set in concrete.
Oh, you've got big. If we're saying to me that, like, I believe that I think that, like, swing voters are, people who are not firmly committed to the parties are going to vote more Republican than Democrat because they're dissatisfied with the cost of living and things like that. But as I said, I think there is still a big variable that's out there, which is how many Democratic voters who opposed Trump in the past come out to oppose him again. And on that, there are a lot of things that could affect that. I mean, the Supreme Court decision on abortion is certainly going to turn out more Democratic voters. And if Trump feels like, it doesn't seem inconceivable to me, all right? There's a little bit of a bank shot, but it doesn't seem inconceivable to me that Trump may conclude the January 6th committee hearings increase the odds of him being indicted by the Justice Department, and to try to make that harder, he announces for president again before the midterm. Like, I could see him trying to squeeze out, to put more pressure on Garland by being an announced presidential candidate at the time they have to make the decision. If Trump does that, that would be enormously beneficial to Democrats in terms of turning out the anti-Trump coalition in the midterm.
That leads straight to my next question. Although I will add as I begin, or before I get to the question, that Merrick Garland doesn't seem to respond to almost anybody's pressure.
Yeah.
Is there any likelihood of a serious challenge to Trump for the Republican nomination in 2024? And what would the chances be for any of those possible candidates?
I think there will be a challenge. I think the chances will depend on events that haven't happened yet, right? I mean, the January 6th committee, as I wrote this week, I mean, is laying out, I mean, it doesn't need to hear from me. I mean, they are laying out a very powerful and persuasive case and relying mostly on Republicans to deliver it. The problem they've got in terms of affecting the Republican coalition is, as I said, that there are hardly any other Republicans who will even admit to watching it, much less say, hey, what I'm learning is concerning me. People forget, I looked this up the other day, that in Gallup, Nixon's approval rating from the beginning of his second term until his resignation dropped from 90% among Republicans to 50% among Republicans. And a big part of that was because other Republicans validated the concerns of all of these investigations. They won't do that now. Now, nonetheless, it is possible that these revelations, not to say nothing of a potential indictment of him in Georgia, which seems like a really kind of, if the Justice Department lets the Fulton County DA handle this, I think that speaks well of Merrick Garland. But I think it's possible that could erode his position. But I would say he will be the favorite, absent a set of revelations that cause a significant number of Republicans, to Republican voters to abandon him. It's not an 80-20 proposition, but I think he has the biggest piece of the party. And I do question, I don't know, I don't have a good enough feel for this. Would DeSantis still go ahead and run against him, or would he just wait it out? And let Trump. I don't think someone from the center of the party is going to beat him. I don't think there's any chance of that. I think the only way Trump can be beat is with a Trumpy candidate without the personal baggage. I mean, this is what happens in parties. The changes become self-fulfilling. The kind of voters who are the most kind of traditionally Republican voters who are the most unnerved by what Trump represents, not only on democracy, but on race and everything else, are less likely than they used to be to participate in Republican primaries. That makes the remainder more blue collar, more non-urban, more evangelical, all of the above. And so if you're going to, Chris Christie, Larry Hogan, good luck. DeSantis, who knows? I mean, DeSantis is the one who plausibly could beat Trump. And even he, I think, would face an uphill climb to the point where I'm not sure he would even attempt it.
So we've got like 5 minutes before we get to audience questions, but I want to get to three other things, one of which actually requires a long answer, but I'm hopeful that you can give a short one.
I will try.
Do you think that Biden will run again? And if he doesn't, because there's been speculation about this in the last few days, who's in the running for the Democrats?
I think Biden will run if Trump does. If Trump does, I think Biden will run. If Trump doesn't run, I think it depends heavily on conditions, but I would probably lean slightly toward him not running, even if Trump doesn't. But I shouldn't say that. I think it's a total jump ball if Trump doesn't. But I do think he will run if Trump does. I think he views it as his mission to, prevent Trump from gaining the Oval Office and destroying American democracy. If Biden doesn't run for one reason, and I also think Biden is less likely to run, obviously, if he's still at 40% approval. I mean, I think Biden it was more likely to run, the more likely it is for him to win. And by the way, we should note, Reagan after 82, Clinton after 94, Obama after 2010 had miserable midterms, all came back to win re-election as the economy improved and it brought their approval rating up with it. If he doesn't run, Harris by no means clears the field. I mean, I think there would be serious challenges to her. I could imagine Warren, Buttigieg, Sanders, Klobuchar. I mean, sort of the cast of 2020. I think Newsom in many ways would be an attractive candidate, but I don't think he would run against Harris. I think Whitmer, if she wins re-election, could be, an important voice in the Democratic Party. Warnock, if he wins re-election, I mean, a Whitmer-Warnock ticket, and it's not a bad ticket to me. I think there's a lot of hunger in the Democratic Party to turn the page. I mean, I was just talking to someone who was doing focus groups among Democrats who were basically positive toward Biden, but broadly felt it wasn't working, that he wasn't able to deliver what he promised, which was either calming down Republicans or unifying Democrats. So I actually think it'll be pretty broad, but if I had a bet, Buttigieg, Harris, Warren is the top tier. Maybe one of the governors. Maybe one of the governors sneaking in.
I'm going to skip my question about demography and the old theory, which has not been proven out, that demography was destiny and was going to doom the Republican Party and give Democrats a hold on power for a long time. And
can I give you a one-sentence answer? The unexpected development was what I call the treadmill, which is that as the share of white, especially non-college and Christian white voters declines, the share of that declining core who is open to a Trumpian style message of "you're under siege" has increased, which has basically left you in the same place, even as the electorate continues to diversify. Non-college whites still are dropping 2 points as a share of the electorate every 4 years, but Republicans are winning a bigger share of the smaller group, which kind of leaves us all in the same place.
I have to move on, but I'm going to ask you, bottom line question, how much in danger is our democracy?
I think tremendously. I mean, I think tremendously. I'd be interested in your opinion, but as I said, I think for much of the Republican coalition at this point, democracy is dispensable. That they believe that their vision of America is under, and I point this at the voters, not just at the elected officials, that they think that their vision of America is so threatened by these urban, secular, diverse, LGBTQ-friendly, democratic, woke mob that really any means necessary are justified to maintain majority power even without majority support. And I think that, as we said before, whatever happens to Trump, Trumpian arguments about stealing the election and so forth are permeating the Republican Party. We are seeing candidates run on executing, taking those ideas into law. We're seeing states pass laws making it tougher to vote, states pass laws making it easier to meddle in the counting of votes. And you have Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema that single-handedly said the federal government cannot respond to this. And you have the Supreme Court that is, basically going to wink at all of this. So I do think that the character, and plus you have all the threats of violence that would become so inured to in terms of public health officials and education officials and local election officials. The character of American democracy is already changing.
I think when you have 30% of a country believing the things that about 30% of Americans do right now, you have a real opening for authoritarianism, because they can dominate one party, nominate people, and then under the right circumstances, those people can get elected, say, because folks are dissatisfied with inflation, and you're off to the races.
And critical in all of that, the 25 to 30% of Republican voters who say they don't believe any of this are still willing to vote for candidates who do and who act upon it. I mean, that is the critical variable.
Now I'm going to turn to questions.
Yes, please.
David asked, with the purple middle being the deciding demographic, and given how the GOP has gone ultra MAGA, isn't it a winning formula for the Democratic Party to be rational, reasonable, and moderate? And then I think he puts a point on this that's really sensible. Isn't the progressive left damaging the Democratic Party's ability to cast a moderate face so as to run the table in some of these elections?
So, the way elections were, and you could hear this in my answer, my formulation from before, I don't think it's true anymore that swing voters are the only variable that decide elections, right? I mean, the other variable that's at least as important, and we've seen this increasingly in both parties since Bush's reelection in 2004, is how much of your own side you can turn out. I mean, Trump turned out more non-voting non-college conservative whites than anybody, especially me, thought was possible. And he did it twice. And even in 2018, they turned out a lot of those voters and won Senate races in Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota while they were losing suburban areas. So I think first of all, I think it's too easy or simplistic to assume that whoever wins independence is who wins anymore. It's just not, or not only, independence broadly speaking, people who are less attached to the parties. So I think that's the first point. Second, I would say, sure. I mean, lefty people, defund the police and ICE, all of these are big, rocks in the rucksack for Democrats to carry. I think an interesting and important question is, why are Republicans so much more successful at belaboring the median average Democrat with the views of the far left than Democrats have been at attaching Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and the others to the average Republican? I mean, there's, whatever you want to say about the squad, Marjorie Taylor Greene is at least as out there in the other direction and arguably
she's more out there, I think. More out there.
Yeah.
I think she's more out there.
Right. But you don't have a circumstance where Dr. Oz is going to have to answer for Marjorie Taylor Greene in the same way that John Fetterman is going to have to answer for AOC or even Nancy Pelosi. So I think that's just kind of like a structural, it's part of it has to do with the, conservative media apparatus, but also because, people point out that in swing districts, Democrats run ads about their ability to work with Republicans, and Republicans run ads about how radical Democrats are. And that's just a fundamental difference between the way the parties are approaching this.
Yeah, and I think the Republican approach is more effective politically. Mm-hmm. But I'd say, by the way, that defund the police is in the Hall of Fame of idiotic slogans, probably at the top of the list.
What about Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion? I think.
Yeah, well, that cost James G. Blaine the presidency.
Yes.
But defund the police, it just shot through the 2020 campaign, made it closer than it otherwise would have been, probably deprived Biden of any chance to win the state of Florida. Look, a party's in trouble when it has a faction that is more interested in controlling the party than in having the party control the country.
All right, so now, but let me ask you the question. So the one that's equally true on the Republican side, obviously, with the MAGA movement, and not to mention the people at the fringe of that. So why is that more of a problem for Democrats? Why do Democrats face more difficulty over the squad than Republicans do over the most extreme version of MAGA, which are overtly a threat to democracy and in many cases consorting with white supremacists, implicated in an insurrection? Why aren't they a problem for Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker?
Well, they should be, and Democrats should go after them. Should ask them where they stand on this stuff. Should run ads about this, and maybe Democrats. And I don't want to jump to this conclusion. I'll just throw it out there. Maybe Democrats are a little too wedded to the idea that politics is about a rational exchange of ideas, when it clearly has an emotional component. Someone once said to me, how is it possible, and this will lead to our next question, how is it possible for all of these white working class folks to vote for a party that does tax cuts that only help, or primarily help people at the top and do very little for them? I said, because their interests are not necessarily just economics.
Yeah.
And they may care, for example, very deeply about an issue like abortion. They may put that ahead of their economic concerns. Now, abortion has been a big vote driver for Republicans for a number of years and cycles. You mentioned it earlier.
Yes.
How big a factor, Rosalind asked, is it going to be in drawing out enough Democrats to vote in the midterms?
I personally think it will be. There is a point of view among some Democratic consultants and strategists, and I think of Roy Teixeira is probably articulating this most loudly now, interestingly, given his long career and kind of where he's ended up. It basically says Democrats can't win the argument on any cultural issue ever, even if a supermajority of the public agrees with them, because the only people who truly vote on those issues are the ones who take conservative positions on them. And the people who take liberal positions on them aren't as motivated to vote by them. They vote on other issues. There's a germ of truth in that one of the reasons why 2/3 of the country supports abortion is because there's a substantial minority of Republicans, particularly Republican women, who say they support Roe v. Wade. I do not think there will be a lot of Republican women who will, say, I want Democrats to be in control of the House and Senate because of what the Supreme Court is about to do on abortion. But I think it's a complete mistake. I disagree with Roy and others who think that that the Democrats can't win this argument among independent voters and among their own voters. Roe has been the law for 50. Every pollster I talk to says that the predominant reaction among younger women who are younger than 50 to this is shock. Like that this is really possible. That one reason why the issue has traditionally been seen as more effective for Republicans is because people who support abortion never thought it could go away. Texas, Bob, has a trigger law that is scheduled to go into place 6 weeks after the Supreme Court. So like on August 15th, let's assume they do this, the last couple of days of June as they usually do. It's possible that on August 15th, all abortion, everything, no rape, incest could be illegal in the state of Texas. And I just find it hard to believe that even with 8% inflation, that will have no impact on who turns out to vote. Even in Texas, 60% oppose a total ban on abortion, not to mention nationally. So I do think I don't know if by itself it's enough to, overcome all the other factors that are going the other way, but it would not shock me if abortion was critical in electing Democratic governors in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and maybe even Arizona.
I agree with that. And I think Democrats have to stop being afraid to engage on these issues. And I deeply disagree with the idea that you can't win them when you've got most of the country with you, but you got to go out and you got to make them salient in the election. Yeah. You can't be silent about them, hoping that somehow or other they prevail. So Brian has asked, Gene has asked, what about our support of Ukraine? What impact is it having on Biden's popularity, and I would add on Democratic prospects? Because for me, the odd thing is he gets very high marks in Europe and very high marks internationally for what he's done, but he doesn't seem to get much credit here.
Yeah, I think that objectively he has done, this was, Afghanistan was kind of a misfire, not only in terms of execution, but also in terms of coordination. In the whole war has allowed him to basically be what he promised he would be, kind of the senior statesman who is, reconnected, knit together the Western alliance very effectively. I just think that in domestic politics, the main impact of the war has been to contribute to the rise in gasoline prices, which is probably the biggest single, solvent of his approval rating. I was thinking the other day that I don't know, you're Bob, the wordsmith here, but inflation is kind of a solvent of democracy. It kind of dissolves democracy, and that may be where we are as in the 30s in Germany. But I do think that any credit he would get for this, I think people do, by and large, certainly experts do, respect what he's been able to do. I don't necessarily think there's fatigue on supporting, the financial cost of supporting Ukraine. I just think that to the extent it's contributing to the high gas prices, that's what people are more focused on.
Yeah. So a lot of these questions we've actually already covered, which I think is a credit to
the question writer,
folks who are asking the questions.
Yes.
But Dwayne asks, could you talk about underlying issues and voter concerns like immigration and illegal migration? How salient are they for voters and for the country?
You could put, you could look at immigration and climate as kind of bookends. They are salient to one side of the political spectrum and largely irrelevant to the other. Republicans are really concerned about immigration, and it goes to this broader point I believe that, as I've written now for 10 years, that the Republicans basically now have a coalition of the voters and places that are most uneasy with the way the country is changing demographically, culturally, and economically. And Democrats have a coalition of voters who are most comfortable with that. Immigration is a very powerful symbol of that. And this idea that the border is out of control, obviously being amplified and kind of taken into very dangerous territory with the whole replacement idea that Democrats are importing more obedient voters from the third world, as Tucker Carlson said, to undermine the influence of native-born voters. There's an audience. There is 60 to 70% of Republicans, depending on the poll, say the growing number of newcomers are undermining traditional American values. And
there's always been an audience for this.
Yes.
That was what was said about the Irish, about the Italians, about Southern European immigrants way back in the 1800s and into the 1920s, when we passed the most shameful immigration bill in our history.
In 1924, right after we cut off trade with, we passed high tariffs and we refused to join the League of Nations. They all went together. It was kind of, America first. Which I think was Harding's slogan, as I recall, in 1920. The concern about immigration among Republicans extends beyond the border. It's also about legal immigration and the kind of the changing face of the country. And as I said, the reverse could be climate. I mean, and democracy, by the way. I mean, there are a lot of the whole democracy issue really has engaged Democrats. Climate has engaged Democrats. Republicans are operating in a completely different world. I do think that for less ideological voters, the sense of the border being in a certain level of high tumult contributes to the sense of chaos that, and that was really important in these California elections last week, which I know we're not going to dwell on for our national audience, but, the recall of the DA in San Francisco, which turned out to be closer than we originally thought. The fact that Caruso did so well here in LA in the mayoral race, even if he may not win, he has an uphill climb to win in the end. I mean, they were both people kind of feeling disorder in their lives, partially from crime, even more so from homelessness around them. But all of this, the border, crime, inflation, the persistent disruption of COVID, gives people a sense that things are not in control, and that Biden doesn't seem to be big and strong enough to get his arms around, and vibrant enough to get his arms around all of it. And Bob, again, this is this is an era in which you were intimately involved. That clearly seemed, and I was younger, but I was writing at that point, that clearly seemed to be the end of the Carter presidency. And when he got into the general election against Reagan, just part of it was that Carter seemed incapable of providing order amid all of the forces trending toward chaos. And Reagan, for better or worse, promised that he could do that. And I do think that is part of, so in that sense, I do think the immigration thing's hurting Biden.
And once Reagan reassured people that he wasn't trigger happy.
Yes, right.
And that he didn't want to destroy Social Security in that debate that Carter held with him at the end, They converted what would have been a Reagan victory into a Reagan landslide. In a couple minutes, I'm going to give you a chance for a closing statement, but two quick questions that we have from the audience. And I think this is really interesting. Who do you think might be the most electable Democrat if Biden didn't run? You mentioned Gretchen Whitmer. Is she number one?
She's pretty good. I think Whitmer and Warnock is a really good ticket. It kind of looks to the future. I mean, Sherrod Brown is really, but he's probably it's probably 4 years too late. I thought he was, had a lot of the assets of Biden and was younger. I thought of him as a good candidate. But if he's, I'm not sure exactly how old he is. If he's too old, I think I would give Whitmer, you tell me, I would give Whitmer a better chance of winning a general election than Buttigieg or Warren or Klobuchar. Yes.
Yeah, but I also think you have to factor in the power of African-American voters, and especially African-American women, in the nominating process, which might give a real advantage, for example, to someone like Vice President Harris.
Yeah, it does. It totally does. But, she faces, I mean, the administration have not given her load-bearing weight jobs. I mean, they've assigned her things like voting and immigration, but they haven't put her in a position where she can take ownership and show strength in a way that would dissipate the concerns about her electability that emerged in 2020. I just think there are a lot of Democrats, especially if Trump runs, in which case it might be moot if Biden runs again. But I think there are a lot of Democrats who fear that if Trump wins, democracy is on the brink, and they're not sure she's strong enough to hold back that tide.
Yeah. So
not guaranteed to lose, but not guaranteed to win either.
One last question, which you can probably respond to briefly, and then go ahead and give us a few closing remarks.
Yeah.
What is Mike Pence's future?
I don't think much. I mean, I think
it's his past.
I think his future. Yeah, I don't think he can be the Republican nominee. I just think that the conflict with Trump is just too big a hurdle for him with too many voters inside the coalition. He could be an American patriot if he talks about. He could appeal to the history books if he talks about what he knows, but more likely he'll just kind of muddle through with some vague general comments about I couldn't do what Trump asked me, but never criticize him for asking in the first place.
Yeah, I do give him credit for, at the end of the day, under immense pressure,
absolutely
upholding his oath. I mean, he had seemed to be beholden to and willing to do anything that Trump wanted for 4 years. And suddenly on January 6th, he stood up and said no. He wouldn't even leave that Capitol building because he was afraid the Secret Service was going to drive him somewhere else. And so he stayed standing up in that cold garage for several hours. So I give him credit for that. You want to close with a few remarks? Because I want to thank you for a great discussion, but I want to give you the chance to have the last word.
Sure. Well, thank you. And it was great to be with you, Bob, and with everyone here. So I kind of feel that we are Frodo and Gandalf in the Mines of Moria, which everyone will remember from the books and the first Lord of the Rings movie, where Frodo says, you know, I just feel, Gandalf, I wish I was not living in such times, right? And Gandalf, Ian McClellan, says back, basically, I'm getting it wrong. I'm sure in the chat, someone's going to have this word for word, but Gandalf says back, Frodo, so do all who live in such tumultuous times, but it is not up to us to choose the times we are given. It is up to us to choose what we do in the times that we are given. And I do believe we are living in the most dangerous decade for the fundamental cohesion of America, the United States, since the 1850s. I over my shoulder, which shoulder? I'm backwards. This shoulder. David Reynolds' book. I just read David Reynolds, a great cultural historian about the 19th century. He wrote a biography of Lincoln and American culture in the 19th century called Abe, which I highly recommend to you, along with his books about Walt Whitman and others. And in it, he points out that until the Civil War era, the United States was a plural, like it was a plural noun, like the United States. It became a singular in the Civil War era. We started talking about the United States, like the united part of it kind of moved front and center. I think we are very much at risk of coming out at the other end of that 170-year singular noun, where we see the red states moving in an incredibly rapid way with support from the Supreme Court and from Republicans in the Senate using the filibuster to take us back to a pre-1960s world in which the rights you had depended enormously on where you lived. And not only that, not only trying to set up the rules in their own states, but trying to change the rules of elections in a way that will give them the ability to control the national government, whether they have majority support or not. And this is a fight that Americans beyond party lines have to engage in. I mean, ultimately, I don't think any of us thought that we would again be facing either a fight to preserve the basic rudiments of America, the basic pillars of American democracy, much less threats to the underlying cohesion of the country. But that is where we are. And there is a tendency to want to kind of move to Vancouver or to turn off the TV. But that would be wrong. Everyone is Frodo. I mean, you got to carry the ring at this point and engage in what is the kind of struggle to hold together the country as a in a new form, like something that even Lincoln didn't have to deal with. This is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy. There aren't a lot of positive examples of that in the world. We have to build one but we have to build one because the alternative, I think, is really dire. So I
Yeah.
would just say, keep slogging toward Mount Doom and don't walk off the field.
Listening to you, I'm reminded of JFK quoting the ancient Chinese proverb, which he described as a blessing and a curse. May you live in interesting times. So I want to thank you, Ron. I want to remind our audience of the upcoming program with the election law lawyer, Professor Rick Hassan, and political analyst and journalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Greg Bluestein, who's just authored a book about Georgia politics and Georgia's potential transformation into a purple state. They will be in discussion with the Los Angeles Times' Pat Morrison, and they'll be here next Wednesday, June 22nd at 5 p.m. Pacific. I want to thank our audience and wish everybody good health, safety, and a fabulous week. Thanks very much. Thanks again, Ron.